and welcome to Heart, Soul, Mind, the regular weekly Bible study of St. Paul Lutheran Church in this winter-spring season of 2021 as we continue to study the Bible's big stories. In this session, we are looking at the retellings of the big story of Jesus' Passion. We already identified that passion story in its central focus is about the not quite 24 hours from what we now know as Maundy Thursday, Thursday in Holy Week, the day before Good Friday, when Jesus has his final supper with his disciples, his Last Supper, and goes out to the Garden of Gethsemane, is arrested, is brought before both Jewish authorities and Pilate, the Roman governor, who finally is the one who pronounces the verdict, the sentence on him, and under whose authority Jesus is crucified on Friday. There is a sense in which the Passion story extends throughout this whole 5-6 days of Jesus being in Jerusalem, the last week of his life. But for reasons having to do with what we saw about the tellings of his Passion that were really very narrowly focused on his death and how that was first remembered in the Christian community, both before Paul and by Paul, and also just because of the length of these stories, we're going to continue to focus on this not quite 24-hour period. And we're going to look at it in Mark, in Luke, and in John. As we've noted, when one opens the New Testament, one might think of these Gospels, together with Matthew, as the tellings of the Passion, and then think of what we see in Paul, whose letters, after all, follow the Gospels in the New Testament. We might think of what's there in Paul as the retelling. But as we've seen, in fact, Paul is writing earlier than the Gospels by anywhere from 10 to maybe even 30 years or 40 years before the Gospels, depending on which Gospel we're talking about. And Paul himself talks about traditions that he received, which he says predate him. They're pre-Paul or pre-Pauline traditions. So those are really the tellings, the earliest versions of telling Jesus' Passion that we have available. And in fact, the Gospels become retellings of the Passion. And it's not just because time has passed. It's because of a crucial event that happens between Paul's writing and the writing of the Gospels. And that crucial event is that the Judeans who were occupied by Rome rebelled against Rome and sought independence to throw off their imperial occupiers. 200 years earlier, their ancestors had actually succeeded in throwing off Syrian occupiers. And inspired in part by that Maccabean revolt, the Judeans in 66 of the first century, Common Era, rebelled against the Roman occupiers, seeking again to establish an independent Judean nation. Well, in this case, they were not successful. The Romans put down that rebellion brutally. It took 7 years, but finally the Romans squashed that rebellion. And midway through that war in the year 70, the temple of the Judeans, the temple of the Jews, the second temple of what we know as biblical Israel, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, leveled, burned, eradicated by the Romans. When that temple fell, everyone who worshiped the God of Israel, who was understood as having chosen that place in Jerusalem as the place for God's name to dwell, everyone who oriented themselves to that temple, who went to that temple, whether for sacrifice or for prayer, everyone who identified themselves as living in the heritage of biblical Israel had to ask a crucial question. How could this temple fall? And where now do we find God? It's in the wake of that catastrophe of the temple's destruction in 70 that the Gospels emerge among the communities that follow Jesus. For one thing, these are now more established communities than we saw previously. They've been around for a couple of generations since Jesus died, and the reports of his resurrection inspired a community to gather around his name and the meal that he had left. So they're more established, but they're also facing this question about how the God whom Jesus called Father could allow this temple to be destroyed, and what were they to make of this in their devotion to the God of Israel, to the God whom Jesus called Father, to the one who had raised Jesus up to be Lord of heaven and earth, the one whom they worshiped. It's in this context that these 3 writers, and actually 4 writers, because Matthew, of course, has his own passion, although again, for purposes of time, I mean, these are long stories. We're going to leave Matthew aside for this week, for this session. But let's look at Mark and Luke and John and see how they retell the story of Jesus' passion for their communities. Most of us think of this story of this last almost 24 hours of Jesus' life as kind of one story that we know pretty well. We've heard it perhaps during Lent or during Holy Week, perhaps on Passion Sunday, the week before Easter, when it's read in many congregations in its entirety, or perhaps from a Good Friday service when we hear the story of Jesus' passion. What many of us don't realize until we look more closely is that Mark and Luke and John retell this story in different ways. And so as you read these 3 retellings, I encourage you not to try to harmonize them into a single story, not to assume that if something is missing from one that you see in another, that it was just accidental or just something that that gospel writer didn't have access to. But consider that each of these 3 writers is choosing how to tell the story. We know, for example, by the way we can analyze the Matthew, Mark, Luke relationships, it's pretty clear that both Matthew and Luke had Mark in front of them as a written gospel. and used Mark's outline, Mark's narrative arc, as the literary critics would call it, used Mark's basic structure of story to frame their own gospels. But they also clearly made their own choices, introduced material that they had, which Mark didn't have and the other one didn't have. They shaped their retelling of the Passion and their telling of Jesus' life in a way that they believed would be most significant for their community. And so, as we read these three Gospels, rather than blending them together and trying to get one homogenized story, let's pay particular attention to the differences between these stories. John stands apart from Mark and Luke and from Matthew in that John does not use Mark as John's model or the structure, the arc of the story that John tells about Jesus. John tells a story that has many fundamentally very different characteristics. And actually, it's in his Passion story that he's closest to the other three Gospels, which in itself is very interesting. It suggests that it was the Passion story that had the clearest pedigree, that had the tightest hold on the imagination and the belief structure of the early Jesus communities represented by the Gospels. But in John 2, there are, not John chapter 2, but also in John, there are significant differences between the retelling that John offers and the retellings that Mark and Luke offer. We'll go into more of these in detail. I will bring specific passages and maybe even some charts and diagrams to suggest how some of these differences play out and what they mean. What I'd like to suggest for this week is that you read through these with an eye to the differences. And rather than leave you out there, flailing around in a literary boat, not being quite sure what I'm talking about, let me offer a few suggestions. As you look at Mark and Luke, look particularly at how Galilee is referenced and what role Galilee and its characters might play in Mark and in Luke. Look particularly after the crucifixion at the responses of the Roman centurion and of the bystanders at the crucifixion. As you look at the three Gospels together, Mark, Luke, and John, and you don't have to do all of these. Take one or two of them that you might find particularly interesting and let other people look at the others. We'll have a rich discussion as we all learn from each other. But if you want to look at all three Gospels, there are a number of things you could look at. Where does the devil show up? What about Satan in all of this? What about that ear that gets lopped off in Gethsemane? How does that get represented? When Jesus is before the Jewish leaders in his questioning by them, what questions get asked? How does he respond? How does that all play out differently? And then, what's Pilate's response to Jesus? What questions does he ask? How does he address the Jewish leaders? What's Pilate's response to this whole case that gets brought to him for judgment? And what about the words on the cross? They're known as the seven last words, but all seven don't appear in any one gospel. We see several in Luke. We see one in Mark. We see a few in John. And you could also ask, how does the writer of the gospel use scripture? How does the writer of the gospel quote or refer to or build on what was already scripture for that community? And then there are three quick ones. If you're particularly interested in John's gospel, here are some more options. Look at John 16, verse 8, at what happens when Jesus responds to those who come to arrest him in Gethsemane. Look at John 19, verses 16 and 17, at how it's represented that Jesus goes to Golgotha, to the place of crucifixion with the cross, especially compared with Mark and Luke. And maybe look at John chapter 19, verse 34, at a detail in John's gospel that has no parallel in the other two. What might that be about? Okay, well, I've offered you 10 or 11 possibilities here. They're listed on the handout. You've seen them on the screen as I've named them. Choose one or two, however many you like. Certainly don't try all of them. That would take hours. But choose one or two that might be of the most interest to you and look at the differences and consider why one writer might retell the story of the Passion this way for that writer's community, while another writer would retell the story that way, another way, for that writer's community. And then ask, what would we do? What do we emphasize when we think about Jesus' passion and might retell the story to our neighbors, our friends, our family, our grandchildren, anybody who wants to know, what's this story about Jesus' suffering and death all about? What would we emphasize in our own retelling of the story of the Passion? I so look forward to our conversations this week. God bless.